Marco Rubio, who dreamed of ousting Venezuela's Maduro, takes charge. Rubio persuaded Trump to abandon his administration efforts to negotiate with Maduro, leading to the military raid on his compound in Caracas and his capture. The capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife during a daring nighttime raid by U.S. troops on his compound in Caracas marked the realization of a longtime political goal for President Donald Trump. But it was a personal victory for a key member of Trump's administration, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Nicolás Maduro had multiple opportunities to avoid this, Rubio said, standing alongside Trump at a post-raid news conference at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. He was provided multiple, very generous offers, and chose instead to act like a wild man, chose to play around. And the result is what we saw tonight. Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, has been one of the primary architects of the Trump administration's Venezuela policy, which shifted the United States away from decades-long diplomatic negotiations on human rights and other issues to the use of military force to remove a de facto leader from office. After all, Rubio cut his political teeth thanks to powerful Cuban exiles who became top players in the GOP at the height of President Ronald Reagan's Cold War. The political godson of hardline mentors from a local king-making county commissioner to then U.S. Reps. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and the late Lincoln Diaz-Balart, Rubio inherited a worldview ensconced in hawkish stances when it came to Cuba and Venezuela, or any country that dared to embrace the table scraps of a socialist agenda in Latin America. Rubio has been advocating for the removal of Maduro and his predecessor, President Hugo Chavez, for years, arguing he is not the legitimate president of the Caribbean nation of more than 28 million people. Rubio's personal history and his close ties to the Cuban and Venezuelan diasporas in the United States not only provided him with invaluable clout on the issue inside the Trump administration, but they also have landed him a direct role in shaping Venezuela's future. With Maduro gone, Trump said the United States would run Venezuela until there can be a safe, proper and judicious transition. He signaled Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth would be in charge, alongside Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who was sworn in as president on Jan. 4. Impeccable timing, some call it Miami street smarts, has always been Rubio's chief political skill. Even as a breakout first-time candidate for U.S. Senate in 2010, he latched onto the burgeoning Tea Party to ride into victory and beat the establishment favorite, former Governor Charlie Crist. Rubio is now under immense internal and external pressure in his hometown, to deliver on his vision for a free and prosperous Western Hemisphere. For the native Miami son, the transition is both a personal and existential one that those who know Rubio say he is uniquely positioned to manage, whether or not regime change happens and democracy returns to Venezuela. This is really Marco Rubio's moment to shine, said Jason Marchak, Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. What we saw occur in the early morning hours in Venezuela would not have happened if Marco Rubio was not at the top tiers of the Trump administration. Jose Malia, who has known Rubio for 30 years, said all of Rubio's experiences have led him to this moment. One of the defining moments of Rubio's life happened more than a decade before he was born. His parents, Mario and Orioles Rubio, immigrated to the United States in 1956, 3 years before the rise of Fidel Castro and the establishment of a communist government in the island nation. Though their decision to leave their homeland was driven by their desire for better economic opportunities, they had hoped to someday return to Cuba, a move that became impossible under Castro. Their son, born in 1971, grew up hearing stories from them and other Cuban exiles about the pain of being separated from their homeland. The family's history and his parents' pursuit of the American dream. His father worked as a bartender, his mother as a hotel maid, would become an important part of Marco Rubio's narrative as he pursued a political career, first in the Florida House of Representatives and later in the U.S. Senate. At first, Rubio did not embrace republicanism. By 1980, when he was 9, Rubio was already passionate about politics and supported Massachusetts Sen. Edward Kennedy, who was challenging President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination for president. Rubio was crushed when Carter won enough delegates to secure the nomination, but Kennedy's concession speech was an inspiration, he later said. Reagan's defeat of Carter later that year and his grandfather's allegiance to the new Republican president made Rubio a Republican for life. In his 2012 memoir, American Son, Rubio recalled writing a paper when he was in the 5th grade, praising Reagan for restoring the U.S. military, after it had been demoralized and allowed to decay. Before his presidency, Rubio got a bit of hands-on involvement in politics and government in the 1990s when, while he was a law student, he worked as a summer intern in the congressional offices of Ros-Lehtinen, a Miami Republican who was born in Cuba and immigrated to the United States with her family when she was 7. 2 years later, when he was 21, Rubio volunteered for the first congressional campaign of Diaz-Balart, a state senator and the scion of a politically prominent Cuban family. I spent the entire summer, Rubio wrote, learning Miami politics from the ground up. Miami politics, from the ground up, is code for the playbook written by Jorge Mas Canosa, a CIA-trained exile who founded the Cuban-American National Foundation, one of the most effective lobbying groups in Washington. Mas Canosa understood power came in 2 forms, cash and intelligence, and it was the wisdom he imparted to generations of aspiring politicos born 90 miles from Cuban Straits. Malia met Rubio when the two of them worked on Republican Bob Dole's presidential campaign in 1995. He later ran Rubio's first campaign for Senate in 2010. On the campaign trail, he recalled, Rubio would often talk about his family's journey to America, their sacrifice and the sacrifice of the exile community. As he spoke about communism in Cuba and socialism in Venezuela, Malia recalled, Rubio would tell his audience, look, I didn't learn this because I read about it in a book. I learned about it because of grown up in a community of exiles and in a home where this was talked about at the dinner table and with neighbors who were political prisoners and friends, and even family who suffered great loss, not just financial and material, but personal family members who have died. Rubio would later face charges that he had embellished his family story. He'd often claimed his parents fled Cuba to escape Castro and communism, when in fact, they left before the Cuban Revolution. But the family's journey has remained a key part of his appeal, especially for the Cuban and Venezuelan migrants he represented in Florida. All those things, I think, have shaped who Marco became and his desire to want to serve, Malia said. So I think it's at the core of who he is as a leader, the experience that he had growing up. Eventually, Rubio's journey would lead to the Senate and to his current role as Secretary of State, working for a president he had mocked for having small hands, during their bitter campaign for the GOP nomination for president in 2016. For Rubio, the close ties between Cuba and Venezuela remained a concern. Maduro, the hand-picked successor of Venezuela's former leader, was narrowly elected president after Chávez's death in 2013. A former bus driver and union leader, Maduro received his early political training in Cuba and, as president, formed a critical alliance with Havana, which gave him the security, intelligence and ideological support needed to hang onto power and withstand U.S. pressure. Rubio believed that, if Maduro fell, the communist regime in Cuba would be severely weakened and could topple as well. So he kept applying pressure. In the Senate, he was a frequent, outspoken critic of the Maduro government and sponsored legislation to provide millions of dollars in humanitarian assistance to Venezuelan migrants and to force a transition to a democratic form of government. As a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he fought two Democratic presidents, Barack Obama and Joe Biden, over their push to normalize relations with Cuba and Venezuela even as, at the time, swaths of Cuban and Venezuelan Americans supported a détente. Rubio has always defended the U.S. right to intervene militarily in Venezuela, calling at one point for support for a coup in the South American nation. This is not the U.S., he said in 2019. This is Honduras. This is Guatemala. This is Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, etc., etc. This is not a U.S.-sponsored anything. This is the U.S. supporting the people of Venezuela, who want their constitution and democracy followed. That's a fact. Rubio